Welcome to the Third Spiritist Federation of Florida Conference, Mediumship, a Human Attribute.
So with that, we are proud to welcome back to the stage our first speaker of the day, Mr. Daniel Assisi. Please join us in welcoming for his topic, Scientific Evidences of Mediumship.
Awaken, you who sleep, and arise from the dead, and the Christ will shine on you. When Paul wrote to the community of the Ephesians 2,000 years ago, he clearly did not have in mind our Sunday morning. But the wisdom of the gospel is always transferable. So today, I hope that you will be awake. It will be very nice of you. But Paul's invitation was really for us to awaken from our spiritual slumber and arise from the dead, not those who do not have a body and who have passed on, but instead from the dead that are living, that go through life every single day thinking about only the material and fail to recognize our spiritual reality, because those are the ones who are truly dead. And he goes further, saying that the Christ will shine on us, as if to remind us that the Christ is also pure, beautiful, scientific logic. For centuries now, much to our own doing, we have often separated science and religion as if they were two completely separate things, two separate children who fight with each other for attention, for their toys. But only recently have we been able, with the help of Spiritism, to understand that, in fact, these are not mutually opposed things, but instead, they should be meshed together. And that is what Spiritism brings us. The ability to make a bridge from that which is ethically and morally relevant and that which is scientifically sound. And today what we hope to do is to talk about scientific evidences of mediumship, which is an interesting topic, because if you are here today, or if you have been Spiritist or are interested in Spiritism for a while, you will know that mediumship is an important part of Spiritism. And maybe you have accepted already that mediumship is. However, whether we have accepted that mediumship is and is a powerful tool with which for us to arrive at great wisdom and knowledge when we use it wisely, as we will talk more later on today in different lectures, or whether you are still in doubt as to whether it is possible for us to communicate with those who have passed and gone before us. We hope that you find some value in looking at some of the scientific evidences of mediumship throughout our history. So what we hope to do here for those who are already familiar with mediumship, is to build, it's kind of like building a building in the sky. You already know what mediumship is, but now we're going to go back and revisit some of the foundations. And if you don't already live in this building, we hope that you join us as we pour some cement, hopefully, into it. Now, I must tell you, I am no expert on these things. But only what I've done here is to bring different information together so that we can have a conversation about some of the cases that point, scientifically speaking, to the existence of mediumship. So I hope you join me for the ride. But let me be clear with you. I have 3 basic ideas here again. Again, brought to you by Cliff Notes. My main points for today are: 1, if we are talking about convincing yourselves, and we will talk a little bit more about that later, all it takes is one case to establish a possibility. If any point in time today, any one of these examples or these instances which we'll speak of makes sense to you or touches your heart, that is honestly all you need. You only needed one proof of something to show that it's possible that it happens. At the same time, not proving something doesn't mean disproving it. And this is a fallacy that we oftentimes hold in our heads. We tell people, well, show me that you can do this. And if they don't do it, it does not mean that they're not able to do it. It simply means that you've shown that at that moment they were not able to do it. But it doesn't mean that they will never be able to do it. So whenever people say, for instance, prove me that God exists. If you fail to prove that God exists, it does not mean that God does not exist. Somebody has to go and prove that. Right? It's very subtle. Can you see the difference? But sometimes we forget about this. So that's the second point that I want to make. So if by any chance today, as we talk, none of these cases speak to you, it does not mean it does not happen. It just means that I failed to bring you a case that you might find pertinent. Point number 3. We're going to talk about what it is to be certain and to be uncertain. Because sometimes we are not certain about what is certain. But I'm very often uncertain about what is uncertain. Aren't you certain that at one point in time we'll be uncertain about certainty? Indeed. So let's move on, shall we? Now, by a show of hand, if you don't mind, how many of you were here yesterday? Wow, fantastic. So I'm going to ask for your indulgence because I'm going to speak a little bit about some of the things that we spoke about yesterday. We'll try to focus more on some of the things we have not spoken about. But please, bear with me if you don't mind. I know you're all very charitable, very kind, loving souls. So please put up with me for a little bit. So how do we go about finding evidence? What is the tool that we use to find evidence? Well, we're going to avail ourselves of some comments by a great spiritist of early, who is often unknown, Camille Flammarion. Camille Flammarion was a great precocious young man that at the age of 16, if I'm mistaken, became the head astronomer of the astronomy of the observatory in Paris. Very, very talented man of science. And he said, "It is only through the scientific method we shall progress in the search for truth. Religious beliefs must not substitute impartial analysis. We must always be vigilant against illusions." So what he's talking about here, this contemporary of Kardec, was that we need to be systematic about the way we go about doing things. We have to have a method and see how it works, which makes a lot of sense when we talk about mediumship, because we think that Spiritism is uniquely capable and equipped to address these things. And why is that? Because Spiritism, as Kardec described, is a progressive body of knowledge. It is something that changes with time, that it builds on. You see, science and religion have often try to stay in their own corner, and oftentimes they refuse each other's influence. But Spiritism is progressive by nature. It started at one point in time and it has kept growing and growing in understanding and in knowledge. So it is only natural that we should embrace science. Because in fact, Kardec defined in What is Spiritism, in the preamble, says, Spiritism is a science which deals with the nature, origin, and destiny of spirits, as well as their relationship to the corporeal world. So it is ingrained, inherent in Spiritism, that we look at the interchange, the exchange of ideas and experiences between the body that we are in right now and the spiritual realm. So it's only normal and very apt that Spiritism is concerned with the process in which we communicate with the consciousness of those who have lived before us through mediumship. So the fantastic thing about Spiritism is it also gives us a way, besides the individual cases we're going to talk about, we also need to see the whole, all the cases put together. Because Kardec was also a very wise man. And when we look into Spiritism, we will see that he brought in the Spiritist Review, which was a magazine in which he published constantly as he published the other books, and he tried his ideas. And in the edition of April of 1864, he first exposes us to the idea of the universal control of the spirits, a very scientific method in itself. And this is what he writes. He writes, "Thus, this is why he, God, charged the spirits to take the message from one pole to another, manifesting it everywhere, without ever assigning one single person with the sole privilege to hear his word. A man can be confounded and can even confound himself, but that cannot be the case when millions of men see and hear the same thing. It is a guarantee for all of us." Isn't that beautiful? God loves us so much that he will never choose some over others, because that would go be against the very definition of love, wouldn't it? If he loves us all so much, then all these things are in front of us for everyone to see, to investigate, to look into. So Spiritism will look, it has looked at all these different cases in the beginning, and seeing the same thing repeating over and over in different places, and the fact that they repeat over and over in different places is yet another proof in addition to the individual cases themselves. And that's an interesting piece of it. Have I bored you to death yet? Okay, so hang in there. It's going to make a little more sense. We're going to get a little bit more specific here. All right, so here we go. Let's start with the first case. We spoke about briefly yesterday, shamans. Sociologically speaking, we see in different cultures at different times, Native Americans in all different kinds of places throughout the world, they have often had a picture of a healer, of a shaman, who was the one responsible in their grouping for the connection with the spiritual world. It has always been a revered position within the tribe or within the group, and they often have also taken on the role of the healer, of he or she who knows how to communicate with the spiritual world and garnish a specific kind of of knowledge that then comes and is able to help the tribe. So funny enough, all of shamans haven't shared the same experience. They haven't come from the same place. So it's fascinating that in different parts of the world at different times, all different tribes have had this kind of role. Again, speaking to the universal control of the spirits. So the fact that some of the knowledge that they've acquired on how to heal and treat people is similar is yet another indication of potential communication with the spiritual world and mediumship. Mind you, I'm not here to convince you. I'm just here to expose what it is. Because to be honest with you, and pardon if I'm a little rude here, but whether you believe in mediumship or not, it will probably have very little impact in my life. I got to be honest with you here, right? And the reason I say that is because we have to be comfortable with the idea that some people will accept some things and others not. And that's just okay, right? So please don't take it the wrong way. I'm just here exposing it to you. If you don't believe, Don't come afterwards and say, I don't believe in that. That's okay. But the shamans then provide us with a piece of evidence there. It's one of the cases that points towards the idea that perhaps there is mediumship out there and that communication with the spiritual world is indeed possible. A second case, it's something we've talked about before. Different cultures have often talked about their interchange with the spiritual realm. The Egyptians were no different. The high priests throughout the times in many different cultures have communed with the spirits, have come with knowledge which was valued by those in power. In fact, you often find the pyramids, the tombs, and so forth, a big monument to the afterlife. And they were done very specifically, meticulous way, according to the culture of the time, because they believed that by doing so, they would improve their odds or assure their chances of making a safe passage into the afterlife. And that's not only peculiar, obviously, to the Egyptians, but to many other cultures. This preparation of the dead is an indication of the belief on a continued afterlife. But how they prepare the dead is an indication of their communion with the spiritual world, thinking that this specific way to prepare the dead is the best way for them to achieve that. They could only do that, prepare something in a specific way, if they've got information as to how to do it. But that's just a simple one. We'll get more specific later. Hang in there. We talked also about the oracle at Delphi. A group of women, and specifically one leader of that specific group of women who was sought after throughout antiquity. Folks from the known world in the Mediterranean scenario would flock to Delphi to seek her advice, and where she would stand in her temple, which nowadays there's some left of it, but there is a fissure in the ground, and with the sulfur inhalations, they would go into a state of trance and utter words of wisdom and give practical advice. The fact that thousands, if not millions, of people over time made that move back and forth, traveling great distances to go there, is in itself a sort of indication of the possibility of mediumship. Because he had convinced many people that was indeed the case. And it was an ongoing practice for many, many decades. It was not just one case, but it was a continuous thing. So maybe for some, this could prove as something that points towards an evidence of mediumship. And as we get closer and closer, we have also talked about how Socrates and many of other great figures have communed with the spirits and have openly said so, deriving their knowledge from them. And we have many of these cases. Socrates is one of them. We also talked about the prophets in the Old and the New Testament, where we see their interchange with the spirits, which we call different names, sometimes God, saints, muses, whatever it is. And we've gotten that knowledge, and we are familiar with those. That's yet another indication of a great number of people who believe also that was possible, happening many times. As it happened, for instance, in the time of Jesus, we see that quite often. The whole story that we also talked about. When Jesus heals those who are under the influence of the spirits, and as he heals those who are under influence of spirits, we are obviously taken to the conclusion that the people who were influenced by the spirits could communicate with the spirits because they're being influenced by the spirits, and that is another evidence of mediumship. If that makes sense to you. If that doesn't make sense to you, set it aside. We have Mark telling us about that. We have Paul saying that he also speaks with the language of the angels, saying, hey, I am a medium, and even any medium there is that speaks but has no love in his heart is like a tinkling cymbal. So as to say, mediumship exists, and here is actually how you practice it. And by saying this is how you practice, again, it's an inherent assumption that it exists. For some people, for lots of people, they believe in the ability of the saints and the prophets to communicate with the spirits. So that's another sociological and anthropological proof that points towards mediumship. We also move on, and we find John saying, hey, be careful of who you are communicating with. Try them, judge them, give them tests to make sure that you're not being fooled by the communication with the spirits, which means, again, he believes in the communication of the spirits in the same realm of prophets. We have Francis of Assisi, who raised us from our habits in the Middle Ages and remembering the purposes of our Christian faith, that also communicated with the spirits and was also very vocal about that. Just lots of different cases about the same Christian piece of thought that's familiar to probably most of us, so they can all be grouped there together in the same place. And we have historical figures, like we said, with Socrates and Joan of Arc, who openly said that they saw visions, and because of that, particularly in her case, she would assemble an army and be able to defeat her enemies, which were in vast superior numbers, because of special knowledge that she acquired from the spiritual world, saying where the troops were going to be and how to engage them. So that is an interesting example that we often don't think about, but it's also an indication, because with a far inferior force, she was able to withstand the attack of the mighty British Empire because of the special knowledge. But if that doesn't resonate with you, that's okay too. As we get closer to the modern age, we start seeing something a little bit more familiar to us, something that may echo with us more. There's the great medium Emanuel Swedenborg, who wrote many, many different works. And that is also an evidence of mediumship, because the ability of one man to write many books. It's obviously in question when you write a large number of books, like Swedenborg did, and as we know as well, like our Brazilian medium Francis Xavier, who wrote upwards of 400 books in his lifetime, of different topics. The vast quantity of books and knowledge that comes through some of the mediums like Francis Xavier or our very own Divaldo Franco could be construed as an indication of the fact that they're really talking to spirits. Because how else could you come up with 200, 400 books on different topics? Don't know about you guys. I ain't that smart. I can't even crank one out, right? Let alone 417, like Francis did. So that in itself, the vast numbers about it, it's an indication that there's something there that should be explained. You can go into all kinds of explanation about, the schizophrenia, split personalities, but unless you tell me that you have 400 and so split personalities, and they're very smart, so they deserve some credit. But clearly that's not the right explanation here. But you get the idea. Sometimes the numbers are so amazing that it really fascinates us. And it's a point. There's so many different cases that we really don't have the time to go into. But we want to point them out to you anyways. We talked also about the Fox sisters and the investigations that went in there. And thus we move into the modern era, which is very interesting, because it stops being black and white. I know the picture is black and white, but you get my meaning. And here's what I mean by that. We often consider mediumship as a tool, as an instrument, and we demand from mediumship a very clear thinking. Either it is or it isn't. And sometimes it's both. A medium that can produce a phenomena today, as we've learned, may not be able to produce it tomorrow. So you cannot always count on the same medium to produce a phenomena. It's not an exact science. It deals with the psyche. So it's important for us to make that distinction. And we also deal with human characters. And we're all frail, and we know that. So many mediums start on a great path, but along the way get carried away or get their egos in front of their purpose, and sometimes stumble. And by stumble, because they are being asked to produce phenomena, they force a phenomena. Or at least they force the evidence of a phenomena. And thus they are caught as charlatans. Because they were not able to produce a phenomena once, doesn't mean that all the phenomena they produced before was not true. Nevertheless, it looks really bad. And it makes us want to discredit. And that's in fact what happens to some of the modern mediums. But just because, again, you disproved one doesn't mean you disproved all. Right? So we have the Fox sisters in here. And more recently, too, we have a very interesting case of Eusapia Palladino, the medium here on the left, and which was studied at length by an Italian criminalist called Cesare Lombroso. And Caesar was an Italian criminalist that was interested in all kinds of things. But the interesting thing about him is that he studied physiognomy, which was the study at the time of, like, depending on how your brain was, they could tell you what kind of personality you had. Clearly, we've shied away from that nowadays. But nevertheless, the interesting part about his is he had a fundamental belief that criminals were not born criminals. So he did many things, and at the end of his life, he came across some spiritualist phenomena. And being a man of science, a well-established man, he studied Eusapia Palladino, and so did many others. A funny thing about Eusapia Palladino, she was a very temperamental woman, very interesting, and produced many different kinds of phenomena, physical phenomena, or phenomena of physical effects, as we like to call. And we're going to see this with Cesar Lombroso and later as well with Leonard Piper and William James, that when these mediums were not producing the phenomena, or in particular case with Palladino, when she was forcing a phenomena, it was so blatantly different than when the phenomena was true that he thought it was yet another indication that it was indeed true, because he could clearly tell when she was faking it. So that's an interesting perspective, isn't it? Because he could clearly see the difference of when it was really a phenomenon, when she was trying to force it, because they were getting paid at the time, and obviously she needed to make a living. So I find it interesting that sometimes the forcing of the phenomena is a proof of the phenomena itself. Figured I would share that with you and let you make your own decisions. We also have, of course, we talked briefly about the young medium Nettie Colborne Maynard that visited Abraham Lincoln. The fact that such an important and wise man would consult with a young woman on matters crucial during the Civil War is perhaps an indication of his credence in the phenomena, and perhaps it could serve for you as well. And we have another interesting case here, which I find very fascinating in the modern times, is that of William Crookes. And William Crookes was a established man of science, and he studied the medium Florence Cook. See that over there on top? And at the bottom, what you see is Katie King in white. It's actually the spirit, materialized through a substance called ectoplasm coming from the medium Florence Cook, which you can kind of see in the background. And this material would come out of her pores and her mouth and her nose most notably, and eventually form this kind of tissue that the spirit used to cover itself and make itself visible. The fascinating thing about it is that Crookes actually got to weigh Florence Cook and then got to weigh Katie King, the spirit, and they had different weights. So clearly it was not the same person, even though you could see the body of the medium right beside it. So it's a fascinating kind of physical effect thing that we can look. But what's really interesting about William Crookes, too, if you go into his head a little bit, is that he was a very well-established man of science. In fact, he discovered the element thallium in 1861. So for all of you that have ever looked at a periodic table and you've seen thallium, you have met indirectly William Crookes. And he was such a distinguished man that he became a fellow of the Royal Society in 1863. And that's a great honor in the British Empire. And obviously you have to be a very well-regarded man. And interesting, he investigated, when he came across this phenomena, being a true man of science, he had to investigate it. And so he investigated the Kate Fox, he investigated for the medium Florence Cook that we saw, and he also investigated the medium D.D. Hume, which is, we spell it home, but it's a Scottish thing, and you call it Hume. And by studying all these mediums, he reached a conclusion that indeed the phenomena of mediumship was true. And he wrote about it, which was very courageous of him to do as an established man of science, almost cost him his fellowship to the Royal Society, because folks didn't really think that was something men of science did, to come out and talk and investigate this phenomena. But he felt so taken by it and so sure of it that he published a study on his investigations of the phenomena with different mediums and arrived at the conclusion that indeed it was the case. So if you are interested in learning more about the specifics, we highly suggest that you should pick up his works. They're readily available, and you can find more information on how he's done it. And perhaps that will serve for you as an indication of mediumship. And this report, so you know, it was published in 1874, about 10 years or so after the publication of the Spirits book. and the medium's book and so forth. But so you can go and find it. So this is, in the modern era, is perhaps one of the better documented cases that we see. It's a great way of doing it, of looking at it. That's William Crookes. This is the medium D.D. Hume, who could levitate, studied by many different people, produced great effects, talked to different folks, many different readings, very shy guy, great, fantastic medium. He's going to be the subject of many studies, like we said. You can also look at his life and all the different things that happened there to have a better sense of it. I know I'm tossing names here, so I just want to expose you to some things so that you can know where to look. Because let's be honest, in 50 minutes, we really can't cover all of this. But I figured rather than picking one or two, we'll give you a different feel for different things, and then you can go out there if you like and see what works for you. And here is Charles Richet, a French man. He received the Nobel Prize in 1913. And Richet, as you know, as you can imagine, when you receive the Nobel Prize, you're kind of like a big deal, right? And so the fact that the 1913 Nobel Prize winner in physiology and medicine actually turned his attention to the study of spiritualist phenomena was very interesting. And he studied the work of the mediums Eusapia Palladino and Madame d'Esperance, whose name was really Elizabeth Hope. And in the beginning, he was actually quite credulous of it. And he spoke ill of William Crookes, thinking that such a learned man should never say such baloney. He probably did not use the word baloney, though. But, because, does anybody really like baloney after all? No, right? But anyways, I digress. But after the fact, in 1923, he wrote 30 years of psychical research, and he dedicated that book to William Crookes, making an apology in written form to the fact that he had first thought that was baloney, which proves his character. That is a fantastic thing for such a learned man to say, you know what, I should not have spoken like that, and now I see that things are indeed different. And he published many other books, including Our Sixth Sense in 1929. So yet, here's another witness, a very credible scientific witness, the recipient of a Nobel Prize, and who also came down in favor of the communication with the spiritual world. And we're running a little bit short on time, so we'll kind of move on. These are some of the mediums as well. He studied Madame d'Esperance, and there's also Leonora Piper, a medium in the Boston area, studied by the great William James, who's one of the fathers of psychology in the modern eras. We won't go much into detail. And we also have, obviously, the work of William Stainton Moses, who was also a medium, an American-born medium, who sought some advice from D.D. Hume and met different people, and also had a display in physical effects and levitation of himself, just like D.D. Hume's not of other objects, which is really interesting, fascinating if you think about it. It sure gets your attention if somebody starts floating right now. Let's not do it. Thank you. It will distract me. But you get the idea. If you want to go over there, you can see how, if you want to know a little bit more about it, this is something that you could look into. You can look into his life a little bit as well. And more recently, we also have, of course, Edgar Cayce, and we mentioned Edgar Cayce because he was also very well studied, and I think something like 15,000 readings were documented. I think 7,000 of those were lost, but there's still a wide number of things out there. So by saying all this, we are not endorsing these people or anybody else. We're just saying, hey, here are some of the evidence that points towards the fact that there is indeed communication with the spiritual world. Please go out and look for yourselves. Right? Now, as we shift from that and more into the modern times, we also have the research of Dr. Gary Shorts, who's a nice man. Some of us have a chance to meet him, and you might see him in the next symposium as well, if I'm not mistaken. He's going to be one of our speakers. And Dr. Gary Shorts, look at his great smile, great guy. And he is a director of the Veritas Research Program at the Laboratory for Advances in Consciousness and Health at the Department of Psychology at the University of Arizona. Which probably makes for a very long business card. But the interesting thing here's some research connected to academia, to a university, a major university, and he does some research, and he became really famous for this book that he published called The Afterlife Experiments. And during a period of time, what he did was he wanted to see if mediumship was really there. So he got different mediums, among them John Edwards and Alison Dubois. And Alison Dubois, you might remember, she's the one that gave birth to the idea of that series Medium on TV. And basically what he did was he would get these different mediums, flying them from different parts of the country, bring other different people to have readings with this medium. The medium would be concealed behind a screen where they could not see the medium, so they're not influenced. Then the mediums would do a code reading. The person wouldn't be able to say anything. They would just read, and then they would rate how they went. And after doing all this statistical variances and the control for different things, Dr. Schwartz really believed that, in fact, the mediumship was there, and he could also sense how some mediums were more certain than others. But that's a very interesting and easy read. It's not really scientific. It's really made for us, the lay people. So you can pick up his book, The Afterlife Experience, if you're interested in knowing how that research was done. And that's potentially another proof of the existence of mediumship. And as we see all of this, I also want to point out some that are not exactly about the research of mediumship per se, but give us indication. And I'm talking here about near-death experiences when folks go, for instance, into an operating table and they pass for a couple of minutes and they come back and then they recount what they've seen on the other side. The really interesting part about it is that they often recount, there's a lot of commonalities between what they tell us when they come back. They all seen people they related to, the whole tunnel thing, they see a white tunnel, they have conversations with people. That's an indication, because it always happens like this with many different people, that might sway you into believing that there's mediumship. If you like to know more about that, there's some great books, Life After Life and Light Beyond by Raymond Moody. There's obviously Dr. Kubler-Ross as well, on death and dying and so forth. So you can pick up some of these books and know more about near-death experiences that might lead credence to the fact that it is possible to communicate with the spirits. And also, we also have here memory regression. The reason why I mentioned memory regression is because we all are familiar probably with Brian Weiss. An interesting thing that happened in the study of Brian Weiss and Dr. Michael Newton. Michael Newton was actually interested in, as he was doing a regression, he found out people could remember a time where they were not in another body, the time in between, the between lives. So he focused his research on that, whereas Brian Weiss is more about the past lives. But the interesting thing, in some cases, very few of them, but some cases, they recognized that there was another conscious, another voice that came through their subject saying, I'm sorry, you cannot regress them back, or it does not interest them. So there was another conscience that came into the mix as well. And if we accept that to be a foreign conscious as opposed to that of a previous life, you have a spirit communicating through those that were being regressed. I just tossed that out there in case you want to read that as well. Some books that you can pick up. It's always very interesting reading. It's really easy as well. And I know I'm rushing through here. Thanks for not sleeping. But I also wanted to make sure that you know, this is necessarily proof of mediumship, but this is proof that the communication between the physical and the spiritual can happen without a person. It's instrumental transcommunication, where you might remember that from the movie Sixth Sense, where he records the voice of the spirits. That's basically what a lot of the instrumental communication people do. They do EVP, electronic voice phenomena, where they use recordings and live in different places, and then by playing it back and listening to it, they can hear voices that were not there before in the closed environment. And there's many different people. We have, for instance, Dr. Constantine Rodiv, a Latin psychologist that has like 100,000 EVP sessions written down. And we have here a great book called There Is No Death and There Are No Dead by Tom and Lisa Butler from the American Association of Electronic Voice Phenomena. And I put this in here because I show, if you believe this to be the case, then you acknowledge the communication between the physical and the spiritual world without a medium. It's already halfway a step there, because if it can happen, it can probably happen through a person too. Just tossing lots of information in there. Thanks for not sleeping. I really appreciate it. I know this is very dry. But what I really mean to say here is that all of these different pieces come together in Spiritism, in the work of Allan Kardec. In fact, the Medium's book is perhaps the best proof of mediumship, because it isn't about one medium or two mediums, about hundreds, if not thousands of them, happening at different places in a scientific way, that all come together in one work. That's why we lead it so much credence. That's why we like it so much, because it is really a joint effort by many different great souls. And thus, serve as a proof, potentially, of the value and of the fact that mediumship happens. That's why I find it opportune to put all of this and say, all of this is contained, these different cases, within the work of Kardec. And funny enough, when we look at the Medium's book, we also see that besides being the first scientific treatise published in 1861 on mediumship, we find it really, I find it very interesting that is really the result of extensive research, right? But what I find most interesting is that it's a meta-study. It's basically a study on mediumship done through mediumship. Isn't that funny? So basically, Kardec develops this tool on what mediumship is and how to use mediumship through mediumship of others. He asks the questions from the spirits and say, hey, I've got this tool, how do I use it? And the spirits themselves answer, which I find it fascinating that you could use a tool to learn about itself. Right? So there's a great source of inspiration there that we could potentially look into and to learn more about mediumship. And when I say that it's really a powerful tool, I mean it, because all the hundreds and thousands of different mediums that came together to put the book together, to contribute to the content of the book, it's yet another proof separate to those individual cases, because it's happening everywhere in different places, the same thing over and over again. So that is the very definition of a scientific process. In science, we want to replicate things. We don't want a one-off case. We want to see it many, many times. And the fact that we have these different cases throughout history and different perspectives on things, and that we also see that witness in the Medium's book, points to the fact that perhaps there is mediumship. But you can say, hey, Dan, that's fine. Thanks for giving me this bunch of dead people. And maybe I'll read one or two, but I'm really not sure. I want to be 100% sure. 101% sure if that's possible. And I say, I understand. I'm like that too. Meet Heisenberg, my friend. Heisenberg, little smirk there. He's a very smart man. He probably knew it. That's why he's smirking. Was a really interesting man. In 1927, he developed what today we call the uncertainty principle, along with Niels Bohr, which was not boring at all. Really a misnomer. Niels Bohr created the model of the atom, as we know. But Bohr and Heisenberg, especially Heisenberg, came up with the uncertainty principle. And this is when they were looking into quantum physics. And this is what he said. They're basically, this study says. According to quantum physics, you cannot simultaneously measure both the position and the momentum of a particle with great precision. When we're talking about, what does it mean? What does it mean? Let's break it down. When you're talking about very tiny little things like atoms, which happen to be, by the way, the foundation of everything you look at. So let's go to the basics. When you look at an atom, it's so tiny and small. The way that you know where it is and where it's going is to find out where it is right now and which direction, how fast it's going, right? We all probably, I hope not, had a highway experience with a cop that has a radar gun. And what he does is you go by and he gets the gun and he shoots at your car a light beam. The light goes, hits your car, and comes back. By knowing how fast that light beam goes and how long it takes back, he can tell you how far you are going because he knows the distance, right? So there is a little particle of light that gets shot at your car. Don't worry, it's not denting your car. You don't need to call your insurance. It comes back and then he tells you, oh, you're going 80 miles an hour, right? So that's how you know. Now imagine, that's basically the same thing that they want to know with atoms, right? For you to find out where an atom is going, because it's always in movement, you need to kind of shine a light on it to find out where it is. Oh, it's there, and it's going 100 miles an hour in this direction. So an hour from now, we'll know it'll be 100 miles down the road, right? If you know a place and you know a direction and a speed, you know where it's going to be. The problem is, atoms are so small that if you shine a particle of light into it, it's like two billiard balls, like two bowling balls hitting together. They're the same size, or even bigger. So by shining that light on it and hitting it, you're really changing its course, right? So when you want to know where it's going and you're measuring it, you're actually changing it, which means you don't know where it's going. You knew, but now it changed, right? Isn't that beautiful? So what he is really saying, the uncertainty principle, is you can never be certain of anything. Because everything is made of atoms. So we assume an atom is going to go that way. And if you think that we are made of atoms ourselves, and there's more space between atoms than the atoms themselves, right? The nucleus of an atom, imagine that it's the sun. The closest electron to it, it's Pluto. That's how much space in between. So we're all made of empty space, and yet it's very solid. Don't ask me why. Nobody knows. And we can't really know, science tells us. So basically what science is telling is everything that's hard here, it's made of atoms, we know that. But when you wake up in the morning, you could not be there. We all know out of experience that if you run into a wall, what's going to happen? You're going to knock the wall. But what the uncertainty principle says that you could potentially run 1,000 times through a wall, and one of these times, statistically speaking, you could just walk through it. That's what science tells us. I'm not making this up. I wish. It would be really cool prank. But this is the uncertainty principle. This is quantum physics. So when you say, I want proof, I say, science cannot provide you the proof of anything. So there is a difference between certainty and probability. So you have to be satisfied and arriving at your own understanding of it. So breaking it down to real life is, ladies, gentlemen, when your partner tells you that they're sure that they love you, you can ask them, do you love me or do you love me in a Heisenbergian way? That's going to throw them for a spin. So ultimately, we live through acts of everyday faith. You could wake up in the morning, put your feet out to touch your cold floor, and fall through it. But yet we do it every day because we go through acts of everyday faith. So why do I say that? Because we have to be comfortable with the idea that nobody can ever give us proof of anything. And if they do, we can walk our way around it. Like I said earlier, the day before, we still struggle, many people still struggle with the idea that man has been to the moon, or that we believe in the concept of evolution. Now, we're not passing judgment. There's their belief, and that's okay. There's an overwhelming mountain of evidence that points, scientific evidence, that indeed we've evolved over time, but yet people choose not to accept it. That is okay. So it is up to us to decide on the merit of things. Don't let anybody tell you otherwise. So you have to make that decision because ultimately it's your responsibility to live with the consequences of your choices. So nobody will ever be able to prove you anything if you're not willing to step into the fold. And we have done that in Spiritism by looking into the effects of that phenomena. We have looked at all the cases in the beginning about mediumship. We've accepted mediumship as a powerful tool for the contrivance of new information, and we have moved on because we're no longer interested in how it happens, but that it happens, because we see it happening and we see so much value in it that the fact that it happens is a foregone conclusion for us. That is why we're not that interested anymore in physical phenomena. We're not interested that much in the Spiritist community in general about seeing tables levitating or cups moving or the like, because that's not going to make our life better. That's just going to wake up our curiosity. What we're interested in is in the knowledge of those who have passed before us and who are wiser than us. That's important, because there are those who have passed us and they're not. We want to listen to the right people, much the same way you don't go to your mechanic and ask them to do your taxes. They're not an expert in taxes. They're great mechanics. So when we want wisdom for practical living, we ask those who are wiser than us and have experience in practical living. We don't ask any spirit. Just like you shouldn't ask for advice on important things to people you don't know. Ask to those that care about you and that can contribute something. Right? So that's why we go back to our main points by saying that all it takes is one case for you to establish for yourself whether mediumship exists or not. It's up to you. And that whether you're not satisfied with any of those cases, and it's okay if you're not, doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Go out and look for your case or for your experience. And ultimately, Be honest with yourself and truthful to yourself about what does it take to make you certain of something. Because sometimes you say, I'm not convinced, but we don't know what would convince us. So what's the point? If you don't know what you're looking for, as Gandhi said, any road will take you there. Anything you do won't matter because you're not convinced, because you don't know what's going to convince you. Set some standards and some baselines. It's a great tool for us in anything we do in life. And I understand we're reaching the end of our time, but as we do this, we are really understanding of why Spiritism is the most formidable opponent to materialism, as Kardec says in the Spirit's book, in the conclusion. It's not because science is aiming to pummel religion, or religion wants to beat science down. Spiritism comes in the middle, not to prove who's right or who's wrong, but to bring them together. Not by opposing them in terms of hitting them or disproving them, but by just saying, we oppose materialism because we're going to explain it away. Through reason and understanding, we'll show you that it does not make sense. And that's how we oppose materialism. We don't fight. We clarify. We explain. We give evidence. What people do with it, it's up to them. But it is up to us to do that. And that's why oftentimes, as we look into the whole picture of things, and that's what Spiritism is uniquely capable of doing for us, seeing the big picture and letting us bridge and connect things into different places, we are really taken by the joy and love of God that has given us tools with which to arrive at our own meaning, at our own pace, at our own time. Isn't that beautiful? That God loves us so much that we can do such a thing on our own time, which I am running out of. And the same thing. But even if you do not ever come into contact with such a thing, we can still arrive at meaning. Even if you don't ever see a case of mediumship or materialization or whatever it is, you can still know it exists through your minds. And that's what the Christ meant by awaken you who sleep. Arise from the dead, and the Christ will enlighten you. Because divinity wants us to use our brains. That's why we have one. Otherwise, what's the purpose? Why are we given us? They want us to use our brains to arrive at meaning. Let's use it. Let's make use of it so that we can rise from the numbers of the dead who are living today. They're walking around without thinking of who I am as a spiritual being, where I am going, where I'm coming from, and how to get there. That's what ultimately the invitation of Paul was when he says awaken, was for us to do that. Awaken to our own time, our own spirituality. And that's perhaps also why Jesus said, according to John, in the last part of John, which is chapter 20, when he says, Thomas, you have believed because you have seen. But blessed are those who believe without seeing. Not because he's asking for a blind faith. Because Thomas are all of us. We have seen it. But blessed are those that don't get stuck so much in the phenomena. Don't get stuck so much in looking for proofs of things. Instead, having arrived at it, are satisfied and move on to the implications of it. And what it can leverage in our lives, and how it can potentially change the way we live. How it has an implication to change our behavior so that we can be happier. So that we can arrive at some good advice to change our vices, to improve on our qualities, and to have more fulfilling lives with each other. And with those that have gone past before, who have passed before us, and that mediumship brings back into our fold. With that, I wish you much love, and I hope that you have the opportunity to believe without seeing. Thank you.